These are your notes for the introduction to our cell energy unit. We're going to start with photosynthesis, but before we start with photosynthesis, we're actually going to go ahead and talk about plant anatomy first. So these are your plant anatomy notes and the first set of notes. There's only 3 sets for the unit, for the cell respiration and photosynthesis unit. So here we go. Let me, from the beginning. All right, so some basics of plant anatomy. Grab my pen here. Most of this you are going to be familiar with. I'm just going to point out some other things, and it is just always good to review anyway. You guys know that roots anchor the plant and they absorb water and minerals. You've probably known that for a while now. When we say minerals, what we mean are basically ions, salts, some trace metals that the plant needs. Really anything besides carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that the plant needs, anything besides CHO, C-H-O, has to come through the roots, right? So if you're thinking about, well, what do plants need to build? Well, they need to build carbohydrates and lipids. They can get that just with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But in order to build amino acids, in order to build proteins, in order to build nucleotides, in order to build DNA and RNA, plants are going to need these other minerals, and that's why you need the roots to bring these in from the soil. So nitrogen, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, iron, magnesium, these are all going to be needed to build things like chlorophyll, proteins, DNA and RNA, and they have to come from the soil. They're not going to come from doing photosynthesis per se, because we'll see that next time. So these have root hairs. Root hairs are extensions, and you can see them over here. Extensions of cells in cytoplasm that increase surface area, right? The more surface area that comes into contact with soil increases the absorption of both water and minerals. So the more surface area, the better. You have something very similar in your small intestine called villi. If you want to Google that, you're more than welcome to. Those are in the small intestine, and they have a similar function to absorb as much nutrients as possible. You guys are also familiar with what stems do. They support the plant physically. They hold the plant up, right? Most of this is going to be cellulose and fiber, which is rigid and provides structural support. But it's also a transport system, right? It also is the intermediate between the roots and the leaves, the fruits, flowers, etc. Right? What runs up through the stem and through the stems, through the trunk, if it's like a tree or something, is vascular tissue. Right? So this is where we kind of get to newer stuff. So the vascular tissue, or the vascular system, has 2 components, and they are basically transporting material from the roots, transporting water and transporting the metals and the ions and what we talked about on the previous slide, right? So the 2 types of tissue in this vascular system are called xylem. The XY is pronounced like a, or the X is pronounced like a Z. Xylem and phloem. Xylem and phloem. So let's look at them in turn. So xylem first. The xylem is one-way flow, right? Things are going to be dissolved in the water coming up the xylem, but for the most part, the xylem is associated with water transport, That's the key takeaway from the xylem, is that water moves up the roots to the rest of the plant, one direction through the xylem. It is made of a structural carb, not cellulose, but similar to it. It's called lignin. So you don't have to really know that, but I'm just pointing it out. Again, these are basically tubes. This is how capillary action works also. These are thin, rigid tubes that water and materials can move up, right? So that's what this is. And you can actually see xylem pretty easily if you eat celery. If you snap a stick of celery in half, all those little teeny, like little hair looking things, that's vascular tissue, that's xylem. So that's how teeny those little tubes of xylem and phloem are. Phloem, on the other hand, is bidirectional. It can go both up and down, so it has 2-way flow. This is if, one leaf needs more sugar than the leaf next to it, it can send it sugar. It doesn't always have to go one direction like the xylem does. There's a little bit of a structure difference here with how the cells are arranged, but you don't really need to pay attention to that. The one thing that I do want you to focus on, though, is that phloem also is going to contain food. And by food, we mean sugar, glucose. As different cells in the plant make glucose, they can be moved to other parts of the plant. So if you have a layer of leaves kind of on the outside of the plant that gets a lot of direct sunlight, and they're making a lot of glucose, they can send that glucose backwards down into the plant for maybe some leaves kind of underneath the canopy, if you want to call it that, to make sure that all of the leaves are getting the nutrients and the food they need, the glucose they need to run cell respiration reactions. So phloem is bidirectional, it's water and food, which means sugar, whereas xylem is one directional, it's water only, even though there are some minerals dissolved in it. And by minerals we mean phosphorus, potassium, and all that stuff. But xylem is mostly associated with water. This is the text form of the same thing. So if you want to pause, you're more than welcome to and jot this down. It has all the main points. And again, we did talk about how this is, where capillary action happens. Right? This is a combination of adhesion and cohesion. So if we go back, right, water is attracted to lignin because lignin has polar regions in it. So that's the adhesive component. And water is obviously going to be attracted to itself because it's polar, so that's the cohesive portion of it. And again, the xylem is a thin tube, so water goes up a thin tube. That's capillary action. All right, we're going to skip this. You don't need to know this, big X. We're also going to skip this. We're going to go right to the anatomy of a leaf, because this is where photosynthesis happens. These are solar panels, basically, right? Pause the video if you want. You can jot this information down. I'm going to talk about the image on the next slide. So go ahead and pause. All right, hopefully you've had a time to pause and you've had opportunity to jot this down. So let's look at what this looks like, and I'm going to talk about this here. All right, so leaves are thin, yeah, but they also have structure. They're multiple layers of cells thick, right? So on the top of the leaf, the side that faces the sun is going to have what's called a cuticle, and this is mostly made of wax. So this is called a waxy cuticle. It helps prevent the leaf from dehydrating. Right? The cell, this upper layer of cells, which is called the epidermal layer, just like you have an epidermis, right? So do plants. So this top layer of cells is the upper epidermis. All of these cells can get dehydrated if they're exposed to direct sunlight for too long. So the cuticle kind of prevents that from happening. If you ever bake, or maybe your parents end up baking something like a squash, maybe you've roasted some pumpkin this fall, a lot of recipes will tell you when you cut the pumpkin or whatever it is in half and you put the skin side up and the fleshy edible part down on like the baking pan, a lot of recipes will tell you to put oil, like a olive oil or something on top of the skin. You're probably either agreeing with me or having no clue what I'm talking about at this point. But it does the same thing as the waxy cuticle. It prevents, as the pumpkin or whatever it is bakes and water kind of evaporates out of the pumpkin, that waxy olive oil layer prevents that water from escaping. And this has the exact same function in a plant. Underneath the epidermis, you're going to see two layers of mesophyll. Meso means middle. So it's like a sandwich. It's like a mesophyll sandwich. You have mesophyll in the middle. You don't really have to know the difference between palisade and spongy. I remember it because palisade reminds me of a palace. I think of palaces as being tall and being tall, I guess. So these cells are kind of elongated and tall. They're like, I don't know, they're tall. They just look tall to me. So that's how I remember that. Whereas the spongy mesophyll, again, as the name implies, kind of looks like a sponge because there's all of this air. They're not as tightly packed as the cells in the palisade mesophyll. And these air gaps are actually really, really important. And that's because they allow the diffusion of oxygen out of the plant and the diffusion of CO2 into it. So those gaps are actually really important. If you're looking at these cells, you'll notice all of them have these little green dark spots. Those are all chloroplasts. All right, so all these little green dark spots are chloroplasts. And you'll notice that these are the cells doing photosynthesis. It's not the epidermis really doing it too much. It's not the lower epidermis, the one down here either. It's the middle layers. It's the mesophyll that are doing photosynthesis. They have most of the chloroplasts, right? You'll also have the xylem and the phloem. You'll have the vascular tissue. The word got cut off here on the side, but that says veins. So sometimes you'll see this referred to as a vein. If you look at a leaf, you can see the veins on a leaf pretty easily. That's just vascular tissue. It's xylem and phloem, right? Again, xylem brings water up from the roots, and phloem is bidirectional. It's moving water just because you need to have something dissolving the material to move it, but it's really associated with the sugar, with the food. So xylem, water, phloem, food. On the bottom of the epidermis, you're going to notice these stomata. The stomata is the actual opening. It's the actual opening. It's the actual hole. And the point of the stomata is to allow gas exchange in and out of the leaf. Allows gas exchange. I don't know why I did that. I could have written the whole word. I wrote exchange. There, we'll just put the E there. Allows gas exchange, right? O2 out, CO2 in. On either side of the stomata, you're going to have two cells. So these are called guard cells. I'm going to show you what these look like in a second, but their job is to open and close the stomata, right? They open and close the stomata. So let's look here. We would have done this in class, but we're not together, so we're just going to kind of look at a picture of it. This is the lower epidermis, right? You flipped a leaf upside down and you're looking at the lower epidermis. That's what all of these cells out here are. Here's a guard cell. I'm outlining it right now. That's one guard cell. And on the other side of the stomata, you have the other guard cell. So you've got two guard cells. And right there in the middle is the actual opening, right? That's the stomata. If a plant needs to take in CO2, then it opens the stomata. And if it needs to close the stomata, well, we'll talk about why it needs to do that. But basically, the gas is moving via diffusion. And that's a key point here. The gas moves via diffusion. So this is not a pump. This is not a pump. This is not a protein or anything like that. This is not active transport. It's just two cells with a hole in the middle, with a gap in the middle. And gas diffuses in and out of them, right? CO2 will diffuse in from the atmosphere, and oxygen will diffuse back out. And here's how the plant opens and closes the stomata. When the stomata is open, the guard cells are full of water, right? The guard cells are full of water. So an open stomata, water is moving into the guard cells. Water moves into the guard cells. That causes them to swell and buckle. It causes them to actually buckle open and pop open because the cell wall is a little bit thicker on the inside. That's why this black line is thicker here in the middle. So the cell expands a little bit. It becomes turgid. Remember, we talked about that last time. It becomes turgid. I'll do a soft G, turgid. But it doesn't expand evenly because of the cell wall thickness is a little bit different. And that's what causes this thing to buckle, right? And you're like, well, how does water go into the cell? Well, the cell actually has little pumps And this part is active transport, and they can actually pump in ions. They pump in ions, right? They make the cell, they say, I need to be really, 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 really hypertonic in order to bring water in so I can open up. Basically is what they do. They don't think that because they don't have a brain, but that's what happens. So they make themselves, the guard cells, really, really salty. That makes the guard cells hypertonic. And then water says, oh, okay, well, I'm going to do osmosis and slow down my concentration gradient. So that's how cells manipulate whether or not they swell and open. On the opposite side, if the guard cells need to close, they pump these solutes, these ions, sodium, potassium are actually the two in particular, sodium and potassium. They pump them out of the cell, and they make the surroundings hypertonic, and water actually moves out of the cell, and that causes them to shrivel a little bit. They don't do a full plasmolysis, they don't completely shrivel, but they shrivel enough to where that stomata opening closes. So that's how the actual cells open and close, right? Why might a plant cell need to close the stomata, right? You need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, and you have to get rid of oxygen. So why close the stomata? Why limit the movement of gas? Think about it for a second. You can pause if you need to. All right, so hopefully you've paused and you thought about it. Well, the reason is because plants can dry out. Plants can dry out, right? This is also the reason why all of these stomata are on the lower epidermis. They're not directly exposed to sunlight. If a plant had an existential threat, something that kept it up, a crisis that kept it up all night long, it would be the threat of drying out. So these adaptations, and this is what they are, they're adaptations. The cuticle on the top of the leaf where the sun is coming from prevents it from drying out on the top. And if you put these openings on the bottom of the leaf, then when they're open, you don't risk drying out either because they're not exposed to direct sunlight, right? So basically, this is an evolved adaptation. Plants that had too much cuticle on the bottom couldn't have gas diffuse, and plants that had stomata end up being on the top ended up drying out. In either case, they got outcompeted by plants that didn't have that arrangement. So over evolutionary time, and it's not hard to understand why, the waxy cuticle evolved to be on the top of the leaf, and the stomata and the guard cells are on, for the most part, the bottom of the leaf. And it's all to prevent the leaf from drying out. Last slide here. Some aspects of plants are simply modified leaves, right? So some other adaptations, thorns or needles are actually just modified leaves. Cactuses, since they don't have leaves to do photosynthesis, they have all of their chlorophyll in the stem. So the cactus itself that you might think of the cactus is actually just a big stem. That's why the stem here is green. Again, thorns also have defensive functions. In the hot summer days or even winter days, I guess if you're a hot desert, plants usually have their stomata closed all day long and they only open them at night. And you don't have to be a desert plant or a cactus to do this. But what you're going to see, and what we'll talk about, is that in general, stomata are typically open at night. Yes, they open during the day, but they don't open for too terribly long during the day. They tend to close. And what actually happens is when we look at these under the microscope, and it's happened in previous years, because the microscope light is so hot, it actually causes the guard cells to close while you're actively looking at them, which is kind of cool. It's too bad we can't see that this year. But it is something that's really interesting to catch if you are lucky enough to see it. So this was your intro to plant adaptations. We're going to go into photosynthesis next time, and I will see you guys, I'll see you guys later.